Great.
So, yeah, I wanted to, and first of all, thank you, Susan, for inviting me, and thanks everyone for joining in. I hope Zoom fatigue hasn't set in too badly. At any rate, I wanted to talk about environmental sustainability in the cultural sector, and that's museums of all kinds, art museums, natural history museums, zoos, aquaria, botanical gardens, historic sites, as well as performing arts spaces and art centers and art schools. Sustainability is a broad net. It includes environmental sustainability. How do we ensure our home planet continues to be habitable today and into the future? It also includes social equity. How do we ensure all people thrive? And fiscal sustainability. How do we ensure economic health and viability? This people, planet, profit metric, I actually like to use the word prosperity. The people, planet, prosperity metric has been co-opted over time by business and has been watered down as an accounting and reporting tool and is being rethought by its originator as we speak. But it's useful, I think, to explain the interconnectedness of all things. So I'm going to share my screen, and we'll go back and forth between talking head and PowerPoint. But I just wanted to share some of my heroes. Of course, this is Greta Thunberg, who is a teenager from Sweden and has gone on a school strike for climate. And she is such a powerful voice and really points the way or suggests that the inheritors of the mess we all made are going to bear the brunt of climate change. I'm sure when the worst impacts happen, we'll all be dead. But what about our children and their children and their children? And that's a Native American construct where you consider seven generations in the future and 7 generations in the past as a decision-making touchstone. So, whoops, why isn't it? There we go. Here's another one of my wonderful heroes, John Muir. I'm not sure if y'all can see this with the gallery of photos on the side, so I'm going to reduce mine. So he reinforces when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything in the universe. Well, this point was driven home to me as a gallery director. And so, how do we get John Muir and art gallery director together? Well, here's a little bit of my story. How did a girl from Oklahoma, City end up being an environmental advocate and leading voice for green museums? Well, I left Oklahoma in 1978 and I went east to attend undergraduate school at Boston University, where I majored in art history and museum studies. After graduate school at New York University's Institute of Fine Arts, I started working as a curator with a specialization in 19th and 20th century American art. Soon I was teaching museum studies at Tufts University and was director of the art gallery there on campus. While there, I got into a censorship skirmish over some strident and politically charged artwork, Guerrilla Girls and Hans Hake and others, and there was a wonderful piece by Yoko Ono in it. Some of the faculty felt it was inflammatory and asked me to remove the artwork. And I said no. Well, that there began kind of a bit of a battle over that, but it really reinforced what I already knew. Artists have an expressive power to worm their way into people's consciousness in protest, in provocation, and hopefully to incite change. So fast forward a few years, many years after a stint at the Rhode Island School of Design Museum, motherhood, and a move to part-time grant writing. When my son was ready for first grade, I was ready. Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
I was ready to get back to full-time work. And after flirtation with a design career and classes at the Boston Architectural Center, I ended up in a second career in business development for architects, specializing in sustainable design. I got technical certification and started writing about the topic of sustainability in museums. So this brings us back to John Muir. Everything's connected to everything else. And by the way, if you, I've tried to include artists in this, some of my heroes. Here's the link for the artist who made this woodcut. So one of my favorite things to say is, why are we saving all this stuff in museums if we're all going down an environmental disaster anyway? It's kind of dark humor among the museum crowd, whose charge is to collect, preserve, and interpret in perpetuity. That's forever. Forever. Think about that. That's 7 letters, but it's huge responsibility. And museums, of course, have all this array of objects and artifacts and living creatures. Here's another one of my heroes, Rachel Carson. But among the paintings and the manuscripts and the tapers and the orchids, there are a mind-boggling range of things to save forever. So what does that mean? How do museums do that? Well, along the way, whoops, I got, whoops, sorry, it's a little trigger finger. I started working for the architects, as I said, and started learning about sustainable design. So the U.S. Green Building Council has established a building and operations standards program called LEED. It's Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. You may have seen this circular logo on buildings that meet certain energy, water, and other environmental standards, which includes air quality for the occupants. So I got a LEED certification. There's a little LEED accredited professional logo down there on the right, along the way to becoming an advocate for green museums. I started writing articles, co-writing them actually with my writing partner. Her name is down there below, Sarah Brophy. She's now back to Sarah Sutton. And we started just writing lots of articles about the topic. We were seminal and early on the scene and producing a body of writing that has actually been gathered in museum studies textbooks as some of the most seminal writings of the 21st century about museums and museum theory. At any rate, another one of my heroes was Stuart Brand. Some of you might know him as the publisher of the, now I'm forgetting it, the Whole Earth catalog. The cover of which had the picture of the Earth that was taken by the astronauts, and was a real turning moment in the environmental movement where we recognized the Earth as it's, we saw it from the outside and realized how small it is. At any rate, Stuart is an unbelievable thinker and a futurist, and he has teamed up with Brian Eno and Esther Dyson and a lot of other smart people. And they have founded a foundation that's going to build a clock that lasts 10,000 years. His idea is to sort of encourage thoughts about time and responsibility and long time. At any rate, I bought this book, The Clock of the Long Now, and read it, and it's 26 chapters. Each chapter is 1 to 2 pages. So it's a quick read, but it's will hit you over the head like a hammer about the future and what it means to be thinking about the future, and leaving a legacy that's healthful for the future. So I bought this book and carried it around in my purse and was giving it away. I must have bought 20, 30 copies. I'd wave them around and give them to people, but I encourage everyone to read it. Also, I ended up writing this book, The Green Museum. This is the second edition. You can get it on Amazon. But it covers everything. It's a primer on environmental practice, and it covers everything from, of course, buildings and operations, and that's your waste stream management, and energy and water and all that, but also how you operate as a modeler of good behavior, being a good citizen on the planet. So that's programming, and also endowments. Who's funding your museum? If you're an aquarium dedicated to the ocean's health and taking care of all the creatures in the oceans, probably not a good idea to receive funding and have your endowment invested in industries that wreck the ocean. So we were one of the early people leading the charge on that, and I'm pleased to say there's a healthy activism around that right now. Whoops. So along the way, we began the first edition of our book. We had to beat the bushes for examples of green museums. The second edition of the book is about 75% new content. People were sending us stuff. So our wonderful friend, Richard Piacentini, who's CEO and director at Phipps Conservatory, has really taken up this charge and is, I'd say, one of the tip-top green museums in the world. He's done everything from his campus. They have an incredible water reclamation program. They have to, for their rare orchids, they need distilled water. Well, he worked with scientists and they developed a proprietary approach to harvest their own and make their own distilled water with low impact and low energy systems. I mean, I would urge everyone, if you're interested, just go to phippsconservatory.org, and he is leading the charge in a huge way. But he also, too, isn't shy about speaking up. So being less bad is not good enough anymore. He banned plastics on site in their food service, and when the Pittsburgh Ladies Garden Club showed up for their annual luncheon, which they've been doing for like 50 years or something, and they started unpacking all their single-use plastic plates and things, he told them to leave.
Oh!
Anyway, the big story is that he ran 3 capital campaigns right in a row, and each one followed the next because funders were waiting to fund what he was going to do next. So his lesson is, you say no to dirty money, you open yourself up to a lot more funding because people are thrilled what you're doing. So he's walking the talk in a huge way. Here off the coast in Chicago is the Field Museum. And I just love this juxtaposition of photos. The natural history museums are known for these big pedimented buildings with the big columns and the long approach with the stairways, but here on the right is interventions at on the sides of this facade of growing food. So Carter O'Brien, a wonderful friend, was the first sustainability director of a major museum in this country, and still among a few colleagues. There aren't a lot, but he has sort of been a change agent from inside out. He established a green team, a greener field, it's called, and that team was a cross-sectional team of staff, and they tackled everything, starting with waste stream management, dumpster diving and sorting, recycling and waste and all that. and just building from small to big. So the Field Museum, I would say, is also one of the leaders in this country, certainly in some ways around the world, for their innovative approaches. They have programs that are out in the community and underserved community, garden teams spread out in the city and have been gardening in empty lots and teaching people in those neighborhoods how to grow food. That's just one of their innovative programs. But again, visit the field and check out what they're doing. All you have to do is just put sustainability into the search bar and a ton of stuff comes up. But what Carter is reinforcing here is that, again, as John Muir said, everything's connected to everything else. If you start from the small and build up, it's easier for leadership to see how easy it is to walk the talk and support actions that staff want to do anyway. These are scientists. They're not in denial that there's global warming. So, you know, what about, here we are in Oklahoma, which is and under the sway of fossil fuels. How do we see what's going on in Oklahoma regarding regional green museums? Well, folks must know the Philbrook. This is in Tulsa. And then they have, in addition to being an art museum, they have this fantastic garden. Well, they started, again, small, annexing a part of their gardens, and they've been growing food for quite a number of years. I would say probably for, half a dozen years already, that program has been in place. And quietly, too, art museums across the country have been re-engineering their HVAC systems for greater efficiency. There's an idea among curators who were trained in my day that the environmental standards for controlled spaces needed to be 50-72. 72 degrees Fahrenheit plus or minus 5 degrees, and 50% relative humidity plus or minus 5 degrees. Well, that takes a lot of energy to maintain that narrow bandwidth. And I imagine, who among us hasn't gone into museums and we have to layer up with our sweaters and scarves because it's too cold? Every staff person I know experiences the same thing. So currently there's a movement among conservators who, again, scientists leading the way, they've drilled down into this 50-72 dilemma, and there's actually an article by a conservator called The 50-72 Dilemma. But they've begun to realize it doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can have microclimates, you can have zones, you can separate materials by what they're made of. Glass requires a different standard than textiles, for example. So that's what's happening. And the Philbrook has gotten a major NEH grant, which we advised on the origins of the program, how to get museums to green from the inside out by looking at their energy. So HVAC renovations also have been part of the Philbrook's green toolkit. Although if you go to their website and you click, search on the word sustainability, there's not a lot that comes up. Just contrasting it to the Phipps, where they have a huge whole array of everything related to their sustainable approaches and actions. Some museums aren't that vocal about what they're doing. So I just did a very quick little search on some regional museums. The Oklahoma City Zoo has a kind of zoo poo program, composting the natural waste of the animals, and that's in place. And I think they have some environmental aspects to their programming, but as far as their physical plant goes, I can't see a lot that's going on that's sustainable. They have a new complex being built right now for turtles, and I didn't see anything about energy efficiency or sustainable design. The new art center just built here in Oklahoma City, I don't think there's anything green about it, sorry to say. So we still have a ways to go, and museums are when we started covering this topic, museums were far behind what was happening in the college and university sectors, hospitals, and even in corporate world. So we still have a ways to go. Oh, one other thing, let me just go back here to the regional, the Crystal Bridges Museum in Bentonville. That had, supported by Walmart. When it was initially built, they had a lot of green plans, and I knew the HVAC engineer on the team, and he said it was just budget cuts and micromanaged, so all the green just got really watered down. Now, if you go there, there's little attempts to signal green action. They talk a lot about their landscape there, but it doesn't look at all like the soup to nuts approach that you see at Phipps or the Field. What about global museums? Well, I mean, there's just, everything is moving so quickly. This is a museum that's under construction right now. Well, I guess it's continuing in the COVID situation, but I just love the design. It looks like a slug in the landscape, but the interior is just so magical. What they sort of highlight as sustainable design is about their energy and water. Again, what their programming is going to be, how do they tell visitors about what they're doing, how do people know about the solar energy production, the geothermal, that remains to be seen. But if they're smart, it will again be, as John Muir said, everything's connected to everything else. So one would hope that their programming and their messaging to their visitors and donors is all about what they're doing in terms of mission-driven operations. Again, museums' missions: collect, preserve, interpret in perpetuity. If you're wrecking the planet, you're not fulfilling your mission. So, you know, globally, there is a recognition that climate change is here and it's happening. The UN in, I believe it was 2015, developed kind of a strategic plan for themselves and developed these sustainable development goals that are intended to be sort of guidelines as countries develop themselves and move forward in all aspects. How can we do it where we ensure we're taking care of our home planet? So about half of them are directly environmental. And also, again, everything's connected to everything else. So healthy people mean a healthy planet. Funny thing about this, the UN goals, a friend of mine told me that he's a reporter and he was covering a meeting of Sustainable Edmond. And it was just a group of people getting together, said, you know, let's talk about how we can make our municipality more sustainable. Well, they were stormed by protesters who had, for some reason, have the idea that the UN is going to sweep into the United States and take over our way of life. And Black Hawk helicopters are going to sweep down and take your guns or something. So anyway, there has been a significant and insidious and long-term strategy to undermine science and to cast doubt on climate change. And that has been a well-funded effort, and it's just, I mean, they've taken the cue from the tobacco industry to, you know, deny the science. At any rate, professional networks is where we also work to, you know, push the needle. So this is my writing partner here, Sarah Brophy in the middle, and then there's me. We're among the founding members of the Environment and Energy Professional Network of the American Alliance Museums. There was no such network. It was the first professional network started in the 21st century, and there was a call to do it because all the museums all around the country employ people who also recycle and have children and are concerned about the planet. So this was a great sort of cohort group that we helped found. And I just was on the website this morning, and I was so pleased. I stepped down as co-chair probably about 4 years ago, and I was just so pleased to see how robust it is and it's going forward. They have a program, an awards program for sustainable museums, and they also are sponsoring a nationwide call to museums to stay in the Paris Climate Agreement. So we all know our president is, well, he's a lot of things, but let's just say that he's not a believer in climate change. He says it's a hoax, that it was made up by China to make him look bad, or that's what he said about the virus, sorry. At any rate, here's his quote about climate change, and it's just such nonsense. I'm not sure, it doesn't look any better in print. At any rate, he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, and in response to that, my writing partner quickly formed, she's very active on Twitter, she quickly formed Museums for Paris hashtag. And then soon thereafter, Bloomberg Philanthropies started We Are Still In, and that is a rebuke to pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord and saying, you might not be in, but we are. So there are currently 3,000 signatories to We Are Still In, and that is across all sectors, hospitals, colleges and universities, municipalities, states. A huge number of people are represented by these organizations, and they are continuing to measure and report as per the guidelines of the Paris Climate Accord. So you can check that out online. We Are Still In, and it's very robust, and it has kind of kept the flame burning on the Climate Accord. Again, heroes, Paul Hawken is a hero of mine. He is a wonderful writer, and if you haven't read Blessed Unrest, I really encourage you. It makes it's very hopeful, and it makes a beautiful, draws a beautiful picture of worldwide how a loose coalition of activists, indigenous peoples activists, climate activists, scientists, and others are all talking about and agitating around and helping to change how we live on the planet. I can't say that I want to be hopeful here. So yes, let's just say that this book is a good way to envision the climate movement as a worldwide, robust movement of just let's say, multi-textured fabric. But again, in drawing the connections between social justice and this pandemic, the indigenous peoples, just as we speak, are facing extermination. This fellow, Dina Munchixa, he's a Brazilian activist for indigenous peoples, and he just was reporting on what's happening with the pandemic in Brazil among the indigenous tribes, and it's not good. They are losing huge numbers of people, and elders, of course, who hold the stories of the past, and it's not, well, let's just say it's very sad. But what is the connection with climate change? Well, deforestation is happening at a huge rate to just feed our insatiable appetite with a growing population. So that deforestation, it results in loss of habitat. Well, there's a sort of perfect storm of loss of habitat, population growth, the need for more food, wildlife pushing into habitable areas, and the increasing viruses jumping from wildlife to humans. And what I've been reading from scientists is this is not going to diminish unless we rethink how we live on the planet, how we eat, how we produce our food, how we produce our energy, how we manage water. All of those things all have to do with one another and have to do with future pandemics. This is a funny little sidebar here. One of my jobs was running the historic site where Flannery OConnor wrote most of her work. And she died at her mother's farm in Milledgeville, Georgia. And when I was working there, the U.S. Postal Service came out with this Flannery OConnor stamp. Oh my gosh, social media went crazy. Joyce Carol Oates decried it. She said, oh, she looks like Betty Crocker, doesn't look like Flannery OConnor at all. Flannery OConnor fans all over the Twitterverse were angry. They thought it was a disservice. They didn't understand why she was drawn the way she was. Well, a friend of mine's an artist, June Glasson, and she said, well, here's my alternate stamp. So she made up an alternate stamp and put it out there, and I think it does Flannery justice. But I bring this here again to illustrate artists have a wonderful ability just, to create images that are compelling and make a point without a lot of words. But Flannery was a master of words, and what she said was, to the hard of hearing you shout, and to the almost blind you draw large and startling figures. Now, if any of you know Flannery O'Connor's work, you can tell that she followed her own advice. So that brings us to another hero of mine, Becca Ennopolis. We've collaborated on some things. I've had her on some panels. She is an activist and saw a need to look at green museums, social justice, and dirty money. So very smartly, she and her partner, Jason Jones, they established the Natural History Museum, and it's in this van. And inside they had a sort of parody of the Koch fossil hall at the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And that was part of their campaign to get Bill Koch off the board of the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. Many scientists say that the new Koch fossil hall there has some biases, and it's an illustration of donor pressure on museums to alter content. So the Natural History Museum, Becca saw it as a Trojan horse to get inside of museums. So she joined the Association of Science Museum Directors, and she's part of American Alliance of Museums. And so they've been doing this from inside out. And she sort of marshaled a letter that was signed by 3,000 scientists to urge the Smithsonian to get Koch off the board. So the thinking, of course, is when institutions that educate people about science and natural world and inspire awe in the natural world, when they cozy up to fossil fuel industry, they undermine the faith and trust of public places in them. So true. Museums are polled time and time again as the most trusted institutions in the country. That more people visit museums than attend sporting events every year.
Cool.
So worldwide, what's happening? Some of you may have seen the actions at the Tate. Liber8 Tate is an artist activist who, the Tate is an open place. You go into the entry and then you're a visitor. Well, they made interventions in the Grand Hall of the Tate in so compelling and interesting ways. They got a huge amount of press. I mean, this is just one image here. I thought was really beautiful. This person laid down and people poured oil all over him. And they've done a number of interventions. But what happened was BP, that had been sponsoring Tate for 20 years, decided in this business climate, oil prices are down, they didn't have the wherewithal to continue their sponsorship. Well, for whatever reason, they wanted to get out. It's good. And museums take heed, other museums take heed, because other activists, this platform London, they're trolling the British Museum incessantly, talking about fossil fuel funding. So the question is asked, would anybody take funding from cigarette industries now? Probably not. So it's a similar trajectory. So here's another guerrilla art group that I think is fantastic. They're called In Decline, and they've been trolling Trump. They're the ones that installed these naked statues. They just went up in different cities all over the country. Suddenly they're there on the street. And of course they got a huge amount of press from it. But they also, they're an anonymous collective, and they went to Trump's golf course at night and defaced the fifth hole there. No more tigers, no more woods, as a way to draw attention to environmental impacts from golf courses and all the fertilizer, and also, of course, Trump's destructive environmental policies, which seemed to be all about just undoing everything that was in place to protect our air and our water and our public lands. So I'm going to leave you with one last image as a way to sort of just completely underscore this point that activists on the front lines recognize these connections between social justice and the health of the planet and the profit side of things, and talking about dirty money and they're naming names. So people who are running these institutions, museums and zoos and aquaria, be careful when you speak out, you announce your recycling program and we've gone green. Well, then you go into their shop and it's full of all this crappy merchandise shipped over from China, made with bad materials. And so it's the idea is to think it through, soup to nuts, because you'll be called out. The Shed Aquarium made a big deal. They had an exhibit and they were going to talk about environmental issues. Well, at the opening, they were stormed by protesters who waived their annual report and pointed out how much money they get from industry that's destroying the ocean. So they had to pull back, and they started from the inside, as Carter did at the field, and are reemerging as a leader with green actions across the board. So In Decline also put this work in the dead of night. They went to the public park in Richmond and installed this clowns, Klansman outfits on. And it's KKK Clowns is what it's called. And I saw this image and I was so startled and struck by just the power of you don't have to say anything. There's no words needed to underscore the point of what they're talking about. So at any rate, that's the group In Decline. You can look them up. They have fabulous videos that show what they're doing. Anyway, I just wanted to end with that image and just ask folks if they have reactions or comments or any actions they're involved in to call out people. No response. Too startled.
I wish I could afford to fund people.
What's that?
I wish I could afford to fund people. That would be
well, that's a very noble thing. Yeah. Well, there are plenty of philanthropists who get it. And as Richard at the Phipps said, when he turned away those garden ladies, after them came 5 or 6 other groups who say, hey, I love what you're doing. We'll fund you.
Yeah.
Becca, too, has been with Not an Alternative, the Natural History Museum. She has access to so much philanthropic dollars because she's broadened her thinking beyond just green museums. I mean, it's a social justice thing. And that is the same thing is true with museums who can broaden their donor base by walking the talk, because they have so much more respect from other funders who are like, yeah, okay, that's cool. I'll go with you. One museum got $40 million from the founder of Steelcase because they were going to build a building and they made to ask for money. And he said, well, what's green about your museum? And they said, well, if we green it, will you give money? Well, he gave $40 million to the Grand Rapids Art Museum, which was one of the first LEED, I think they're LEED Gold built museums in the country. But in the second edition of our book, we went back and revisited our case studies, and they have new leadership. They had funding downturn. What's happening green? Not so much. Same thing with the Getty Art Museum. They were all about green, and then they had a change of leadership. And for the second edition, I called them up, and very quickly the facilities manager passed me over to the press officer because they didn't want to say anything. Also, the Sam Noble Museum, talk about regional museums at OU, they built that museum, and Ellen Sinsky was the director, and she pushed for it to be LEED. Made a big deal, and the university put out press releases. It was all great, and this and that. Well, that's sort of fallen by the wayside. You go to their website, there's hardly any mention of it at all. So it's a continuous journey. It's not a check box. It's like, oh, we're green, check it off. No, you have to constantly revisit, reevaluate, remeasure in order to move forward. So if there's not leadership, then we're in trouble.
Well, what can we do about Oklahoma Contemporary? That's very disturbing.
Well, I think Susan had a question. I'll
sorry.
get to that.
No. I was actually going to say something about that. So Elizabeth, you might answer that. Jenny's question.
Well, I mean, I'll just use my own personal experience. I happened to meet the facilities manager. There's the head facilities manager and then the assistant. Well, a friend of a friend introduced me to the assistant. I mean, someone who's a friend with her. And I was talking to her and I asked her is there anything green about the museum? And she said no. And then I told her that I had written this book and she said, oh my gosh, I know that book. I really want that. And I said, well, check it out. And if you want to, I mean, that might give you some tips on things that you can do beyond just the architecture. So I was still around the gallery and she came back and she said, I just bought your book online. Come meet my boss. So I met her and both of them confirmed there was nothing green about the museum, but they themselves wanted to form a green team and start recycling. I mean, that's where it often starts, is with staff like taking the recycling home in their car to recycle at home because the museum has no institutional recycling. So it's really, again, from the inside is where it has to happen, and from the top, recognizing and giving support to the staff.
Right. Any other questions, Lawrence?
Yeah, so I was wondering if...
Hi, Lawrence.
Hey, how you been?
Good.
I was wondering if you've noticed that there is a trend up and down of corporate interest in the environment. In the way, like every June for the past few years, corporates are pandering towards LGBT and putting rainbows in their logos. So do you notice that there's a wave of interest in corporates? In companies trying to
definitely
be green, and then it goes away and it comes back. Is there kind of a rhyme or reason or a pattern to that?
Well, first of all, I just have to comment on what's behind you, the petroleum alliance.
Yeah, I thought of that. I'm just visiting.
Well, I mean, as I said earlier, the people, planet, profit metric has been co-opted by corporations to have a nice page in their corporate report that says, here's how we're doing on the people, planet, profit metric. And often it's around, sort of low-hanging fruit. Here's how we've reduced our carbon by, our buildings and operations, or waste stream diversion or something. But those things sort of ebb and flow. People are like, oh, we have to cut budgets. We'll cut the sustainability program. So it really, there's sort of two things that have to happen. It has to be embedded in the culture of the corporation. So if something changes at the top and the person's not into it, there's a surge that applies pressure. There's societal shame. That's what the activists have been doing, just call out David Koch. I mean, he is part of a huge denial network that's funding all sorts of stuff, getting climate change out of textbooks, everything. So, I mean, there's an element of shame. There's an element of profit. I mean, now renewables, that's a better proposition than fossil fuels economically. So if somebody sees that and gets onto it and pushes it forward and they get a lot of goodwill, then hey, it looks good for the company. So I don't know if that answered your question.
It does.
It also has to do with political wins.
So do you think that we have a group or a following big enough in Oklahoma where they might be able to put that societal pressure or shame to, other way, convince some organizations to make changes?
Well, I think it's easier when renewables are so technologically easier now. I mean, renewables are creating more jobs in this country than fossil fuels now. And especially in this state, you look at, oh, everybody knows what the cost of, what the price of oil is. Everybody. Oh, what's happening with the price of oil now? Our whole economy is built on that. And, I grew up here and I've been hearing my whole life, oh, Oklahoma is to diversify its economy. We're too reliant on fossil fuels. I've been hearing, not fossil fuels, the oil industry. So
petroleum.
Fossil fuels demonstrates an understanding that it's connected to climate change. But wanting to diversify the economy when I grew up was about just the ebb and flow of the oil industry. Everybody always knows it's up and down. Well, hopefully it's down and we can keep the pressure on. Jenny's husband, Frank, is part of the Renewable Energy Network here in Oklahoma, and they've been doing a lot to apply pressure and educate people. It's a huge job creator. And wind turbine technicians and solar installers, those are the biggest jobs being created in the country. And Oklahoma is the leader in that. So Jenny, you're raising your hand.
I know. Well, one of the things that I went to the history museum, and the new one, and I'd not been there, and there's this huge exhibit about petroleum and how wonderful it is in Oklahoma. We need another one that is saying that, we have more jobs in Oklahoma over renewables than we do in petroleum. We need to, this is the past and this is the future.
I love that, Jenny. Let's do an intervention in their big hall there. You want to?
Yes. But we need to get some of the people that are, the big renewables.
Yep.
And they have to get in and fund an exhibit.
All right. Well, listen, let me just, I forgot to do this last bit. So here's my contact info. Feel free to, I meant to wave my card at the front because my name is frequently misspelled. So I wanted to make a point. It's WYLIE. So you can find me there. There's my contact info. Anybody who wants to do an intervention, we'll be all friendly and nice. I was just reading an article about the Antifa, which now is being demonized by Bill Barr and others in all press conferences. Everyone who is deemed violent at the protest is somehow drawn as Antifa. Well, I just read an article about it, and it's a loose coalition. Some of them dress up in unicorn outfits and have, bubble machines and show up at protests with a sort of crazy different idea. It's not, they are anti-fascist. It should be controversial not to be anti-fascist. So read a little bit about it before, painting a broad brush. The Antifa is out there being violent. So we could go to, give Bob Blackburn the heads up and say, we're going to go to the museum and we're going to unfurl something. I don't know, but make it fun and provocative. And so the rest of it, I won't do this in a public forum now because the rest of this has to be secret. So anybody who wants to be involved, let me know.
Any other questions or comments for Elizabeth? We're just about at the hour, so I'm sure she's
just to say, Susan, thank you very much. And Elizabeth, I found it absolutely fascinating, and the journey that you took us on connected so many different contexts in terms of your interest in architecture, your interest in the arts, the social consciousness, the importance of leadership that is in touch with people, and that there's a vision and a concept that's embedded. It really was very, very powerful. And thank you very, very much. Really, really very, very informative. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah.
Right. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. I was so timely too, and so very timely. All of these issues are on all of our minds all the time. So I really appreciate you, making the connections and pulling it together in such a wonderful way. I want to also say that Josette will be our next speaker in 2 weeks on July the 10th. Josette has lived around the world, including in Oklahoma, and is now at home in Brittany. But I'm sure she'll have a lot to say about her own work and where she's traveled and how the environment has really impacted her work as an artist as well.
Wonderful.
So thank you,
Thanks
Elizabeth.
for listening, everyone.
Well, thank you.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. It's
Yeah, thank you
wonderful.
so much. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time. Josette?
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Okay.
Okay, everyone, take care.
Thanks,
Thank
Elizabeth.
you.
Okay, thank you so much.
Wear your masks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Wear your